Formula One teams spend a massive $14 million every single race weekend in a season, and with nearly 500 million fans worldwide, there's a lot at stake, from revenue to the reputation. There is a ton that goes into it behind the scenes of this incredibly complex and expensive sport. Plenty of races take place on back-to-back weekends where there's only a 3-day turnaround time between the ending of a race and the setup for practice at the next location. And races oftentimes aren't to the next closest city on the schedule. The longest trips can be thousands of miles away. It's a massive logistical challenge to ship tons of expensive equipment halfway around the world in just a few days and then quickly set up for the next race. That brings us to our first cost, which is shipping the equipment, the car, and the entire team traveling to the location of the race. Transportation is done by boats, planes, and trucks, with DHL being F1's official logistics partner. DHL estimates that teams typically move between 50 to 60 tons of equipment, not every weekend, but over the season. And that cost sums up to about $8 million over the course of the season. Just a quick note before I begin adding up these expenses, a lot of these costs I couldn't find on a per weekend basis, so I found the seasonal costs, and then we're just going to be dividing by 24, which is the number of weekends that are in a season. It's still going to be a pretty accurate representation for everything that F1 teams spend money on each weekend. So for our first cost, over the 24 weekends, it's going to be $330,000 to ship everything between races. The next cost is going to be the paddock and motorhome, which for teams like Red Bull and Ferrari, which tend to go pretty all out on their setups, could cost around $1 million. So over each weekend, that's going to be about $42,000. Our running total is already at $370,000 per race weekend, and that's just with the main transportation and preparation costs before the weekend even starts. Teams will spend about $500,000 on fuel per driver, and that's because they go through 200,000 liters of petrol every season. So over the course of the weekend, let's say about 20 practice laps, 10 qualifying laps, and then 70 laps on race day. That's about 100 laps in total over a weekend. And so per driver, they'll spend about $21,000 on fuel, but then in total, they spend $42,000 per weekend. Also, the fuel tanks alone cost $150,000. So for 2 drivers on the team, it's about $300,000 over a season. So at a per weekend cost, that'll be about $13,000. Tires cost around $3,000 per set of 4. So including practice and qualifying, each F1 car will typically go through 8 to 10 every weekend. So with 2 drivers, that's between 16 and 20 sets of tires, which will mean they spend about $60,000 every weekend. Now, this puts our running total at around $500,000, and we haven't even gotten to the expensive parts yet. Drivers are definitely the most important aspect of a successful racing team. One team's car could be far better than everyone else's, but if the driver can't stop spinning into walls and can't finish races, then the car really makes no difference. This is why teams spend millions of dollars and even tens of millions of dollars to get the best drivers in their cars. Max Verstappen's contract with Red Bull pays him $55 million every year until 2028. He's definitely one of the best drivers in the sport, and Red Bull must expect him to only get better if they're paying him this much for this long. So at $55 million, and with there being 24 races this upcoming season, they'll be paying him at a rate of $2.3 million every race weekend. And Red Bull's second driver, Sergio Perez, will be making $10 million this year. So that means he'll be making a little over $400,000 every race. But this is just for salaries. Drivers also make bonuses for completed races, wins, and just total points scored throughout the season. I'm going to stick with the Red Bull example. Last season, Max Verstappen made $20 million in bonuses, and so did Sergio Perez, making $20 million. So that's at a rate of $1.6 million every race weekend. With the exception of engines, driver salaries and bonuses are the largest costs for F1 teams. So now our current running total is $4.8 million. For pretty much all the expenses in this video, they're going to vary between teams, and for things like positions and their salaries, as well as cost for equipment, not all information is readily available, so I either picked what seems like the most accurate number that I found, or just taking my best guess. So we've already covered the actual drivers, but now on to some more of the staff positions. The team principal makes between $1 and $10 million per season, with the highest paid right now being Christian Horner for $10 million, and that equals $415,000 every weekend. Then there's the technical director, who gets paid $500,000 a year, and that'll be about $21,000 every weekend. Then there's the chief aerodynamicist, making $200,000 a year, and which would be about $8,000 every race weekend. Then there's the chief designer, also $200,000, $8,000 per weekend. Chief research and development, $200,000 a year again, $8,000 per weekend. And then there's race engineers, another $200,000 salary for $8,000 per week. Pit wall strategists, $7,500 per week. Mechanics, analysts, and media team, making about $15,000 altogether per week. Most of the positions that I just listed aren't directly involved with the car on race day, but for this next group, they absolutely are, and probably the most important, second to the driver, and that is the pit crew. In a sport where fractions of a second mean the difference between winning and losing, having the best possible pit crew is critically important. Of course, there's a lot of preparation behind the scenes, but they actually only work on the car for a few minutes during a race. But in those few minutes, they need to have it perfect. That's why teams spend a lot of money hiring the fastest and most skilled mechanics and take care of them with a nice paycheck. The pit crew is really a team within a team, so there are a number of roles. There are about 20 pit crew members, from the leader of the team to a dedicated fire extinguisher man. Pit crew chiefs can earn $1 million per season. That's $42,000 every weekend. Then there's the wheel gun operators, making $350,000 per season. And with there being 4 of them, that's going to be $58,000 every weekend. Then there's the 4 tire carriers, making $250,000 per season each. That's $42,000 per weekend total. There's 2 jackmen, 2 wingmen, and 2 stabilizers, making $150,000, $150,000, and $90,000 respectively. And then there's the fire extinguisher man, making $30,000 per season, $1,200 per race. So for a part-time job, that's not bad. Teams also have travel managers, logistics coordinators, and software developers. Let's say each of them make $100,000 per season. After all these additional staff costs, the current running total sits at $5.5 million. And we really actually haven't even gotten to making the car yet. All right, now this is where things start to escalate a little more quickly when teams are putting together and testing their cars. Aerodynamics testing in wind tunnels cost teams around $10 million each season. And the same goes for track testing. So putting these two together and then on a per weekend basis, it's about $830,000 per weekend. Teams typically spend around $10 million for a single engine, and they'll go through multiple in a season. But Red Bull spends $17 million on their engines. So let's say they go through 4 to 5 engines per car per season. That means that they'll go through 10 engines in a season, which brings the total to $170 million. And so on a per weekend basis, that's going to be $7 million additional dollars, bringing our total from $6 million to $13 million. The driver's steering wheel will cost between $60,000 to $100,000, so that's about $8,000 per weekend. The gearbox will cost $400,000 to $600,000. So going through multiple in a season, let's say they use 4 for each driver, that's going to be an additional $200,000 every weekend. Then there's the brakes and hydraulics, which they spend $170,000 on. With 2 drivers, that puts it at $14,000 per weekend. The carbon fiber monocoque, which is $650,000 for each. It's a chassis that acts as a safety shell for drivers and is very durable. So let's say they only replace it once every season. That's going to be an additional $108,000 per weekend. Suspension, $200,000 at $17,000 per weekend. And then spare parts. I'm just going to lump all of it together, and things like the front wing, the back wing, the suspension, gearboxes, aerodynamic pieces, all can be like $5 million. So let's say $415,000 per weekend in costs. All that right there put us at over $14 million per race weekend. Next, let's talk about the FIA. They are the governing body of everything F1, and they have the authority to fine for penalties on and off the track. And they charge each team $600,000 at the start of every season. So that'll be $25,000 every weekend at that rate. And they made $27 million from all the teams for this upcoming season in 2023. Teams must also pay $7,000 for every point that they score. And so using the Red Bull example, they scored 759 points, with Verstappen having 454, and then Perez scoring 305. So this would mean that they paid the FIA $5.3 million just from scoring points. And so spread out across all the weekends, that's $220,000 per race. We've pretty much covered everything from the costs between weekends, during the races, and across the entire season. But how much does it add up in total? Well, as I've mentioned, these costs vary between teams, and some teams spend hundreds of millions more than others. But as a prime example, Max Verstappen getting paid $55 million a year is basically over half what some teams spend over an entire season. And finally, for the grand total for what the average F1 team will spend in a weekend, it's nearly $14.5 million. And so bring that back to the over the season cost by multiplying it by how many weekends there are in a season, we get $346 million. Now that number is lower than what Red Bull and Ferrari, some of the largest spenders of last year, said that they had in their budget, which was I think over $400 million. It's still a pretty close guess, and obviously I'm not going to get all the costs that they're going to be aware of, and I just simply cannot find. So that's what it is, $346 million, $14 million every single weekend. That's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.